Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you across this interconnected globe. Welcome to what is the second event stemming from a publication series on the future of multilateralism by the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung's offices in Brussels and Washington, D.C. My name is Viola Ginger, and it's my honor to be your moderator today. I'm Washington editor for Just Security, an online forum for analysis of national and international security. It's based at the New York University School of Law. I'm a career journalist, formerly at Bloomberg News and the United States Institute of Peace, and also spent 7 years in Eastern Europe and the Balkans supporting independent media there and as a freelance writer. I'm now based in Washington. I'm joined today by an amazing group of 3 of the authors who contributed to the Multilateralism series, as well as by 3 policymakers and experts from the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations. But first, a few quick reminders. This event is being live streamed and it is being recorded, and a video will be posted on YouTube afterwards. We do have simultaneous translation available for French and Spanish, and you can see that function in the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. We invite all of you in the audience to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, which you can write in any of the 3 languages. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Eva van der Wacht, Director of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung European Union in Brussels, for a few words. Eva, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Viola, for your kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A very warm welcome to our event on shaping the future of multilateralism from Brussels. It is my honor to welcome you on behalf of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, also in the name of my dear colleague, Bastian Hermeson, Director of our Washington, D.C. office. Thank you for joining us today. Please allow me a few introductory remarks on our project, Debating the Future of Multilateralism. It is clear that the multiple crises of the 21st century are all interconnected and demand multilateral solutions, be it the climate crisis, the global health crisis, biodiversity loss, or rising levels of debt. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed many of the shortcomings in the multilateral structure. We need a debate on more effective multilateral cooperation. Unfortunately, countries with emerging and developing economies have been often left out or sidelined within multilateral decision and rule-making processes. The global debt, health, climate, and biodiversity crises leave them now in an even more vulnerable situation. The difficulties around COP26 for representatives, stakeholders, and civil society actors from the global south to join the negotiations are just the latest example. Against this background, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation conducted a publication series that focuses on inclusive pathways to a just and crisis-resilient global order, an international order that takes into account the needs and priorities of countries with emerging and developing economies and of the most vulnerable people and communities. The papers are all online, and you will find the link to our web dossiers on the future of multilateralism in the chat. The authors offer civil society perspective on the importance of climate finance, fair trade rules, and a global economic system that promotes and protects diversity, human rights, and gender equality. We would like to alert policymakers in the EU and the US on the lack of more diverse voices in the debate onto how to shape the future of multilateralism. We aim to make perspectives from countries with emerging and developing economies visible and support those voices to play a more prominent role in efforts to reboot multilateral decision-making and structures. Before the summer break, we held a first event, Viola already mentioned that, addressing the connections between debt and climate finance and the conditions for sustainable trade with goods as well as digital services. In case you missed it, you are very welcome to watch the recording available in English, Spanish, and French on our websites. With the second event, we would like to continue the conversation on reforms towards a just, sustainable, and democratic international order by exploring how to protect human rights and particularly gender rights in multilateral efforts. It is crucial to understand the gender differentiated impacts of today's crises. Putting on a gender lens opens up new debates on many issues, ranging from climate to trade or digital governance. In the context of the global health crisis, leaders from the US and the EU stressed the importance to build back better. Many of them have pledged a recovery that promotes the health and prosperity of our people and planet. We would like to discuss with you today how to turn this vision into reality by appropriate actions and corresponding measures. In closing, I would like to thank the authors and today's speakers for joining us in this effort. My special thanks go to my dear colleagues of our international offices in Washington, D.C. and Brussels for their commitment and excellent work. I'm looking very much forward to a fruitful discussion and will now pass the floor back to Viola. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eva, for the warm welcome for all of us. I'd also like to mention that Jan Schalatek, the Associate Director of Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, Washington, D.C., will be with us today to help manage this production in the background. Thank you very much, Liana. I was privileged to help edit the Böll series on the future of multilateralism. Today, 3 of the authors will present their views, as Eva mentioned, on the gender dimensions of multilateral efforts in areas ranging from climate finance to the governance of data and digital technologies. I'm sure all of you are aware too of the impending International Climate Summit in Glasgow in November that Eva referenced, such a crucial moment. So this is a very important discussion today. The presentations from these authors and the papers they wrote, which, as Eva mentioned, you can find on the Böll website, will be the basis for the high-level panel discussion following immediately afterwards with the 3 policymakers and experts. Now I would like to turn it over to the first of our 3 authors. Mariama Williams is director of the Institute of Law and Economics in Jamaica, a member of the Caribbean Feminist Action Network, the Gender and Trade Coalition, and a principal researcher for the Integrated Policy Research Institute. She's senior associate, the Political Ecology and Sustainability Program for Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DAWN. She is author of the study in our series entitled Just and Sustainable Finance to Address Multiple Global Crises, demands a focus on gender equality. She's a feminist economist with more than 20 years' experience working on economic development and macroeconomic, trade, external debt, and finance issues. She focuses on gender equality and women's empowerment, social equity, sustainable finance and development, and climate change. She has published widely. Her books include Gender and Climate Finance Coming Out of the Margins, Gender Issues in the Multilateral Trading System, and Trading Stories, Experiences with Gender and Trade. We look forward to hearing from you, Mariama. Over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, or the global audience for this event. I thank my panelists and my fellow colleagues, and thank the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for organizing both the publication and organizing this very important, interesting discussion that we will have, part 1 of which many of you might have participated in. It's a great honor for me to be part of this event, and I will try to make some critical remarks and then follow some of the interactions between and among the speakers. I think for me, the critical point at this juncture, right? We're at top of the middle of the 21st century. We have COVID, we have climate crisis, we have persistent economic inequality, which has always been a structural feature of the global economy. But I think the COVID has really thrown open all the windows, all the doors, and maybe knocked off some roofs on the pervasiveness of inequality and the detriment that it poses for women's, men, children, boys and girls' lives in the developing country in particular, but also within the developed countries where there's Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color, among other poor persons who over the last 10 years 20 years even, of rampant accumulation have not been the beneficiaries of this system and have been left vulnerable to the plagues of the various pandemics, COVID being one, which many scientists say others are out there waiting on. So it's a critical kairos moment, and we use that word lightly a lot, but it's also about what do we learn from this and how do we move forward? Multilateralism before COVID was already tenuous in many respects. We had 4 years of disastrous US leadership on many points, overturning some of the principle of multilateralism, but also throwing open the curtains also of the hypocrisy behind multilateralism as led by the US and others. I think the COVID has just opened that wide open, and the vaccine debacle has really made that even more pronounced, that all of the talks and the discussions we've had over these 20, 30 years about human rights, justice, have not been deeply embedded as we would have liked to think from civil society. It's interesting to see what we'll come up with in Scotland at COP26. So for me, multilateralism faces a dilemma as to how we move forward in a world now beset by these different crises, and how do we move forward? What are the policy dimensions? If we look at the policy reactions of the series of crises that have been happening, financial and economic crisis, the instinctive reaction has always been about protecting the market. Even with climate, we see it's about the risk of the financial sector as a predominant thing on central bankers, not the risk of vulnerable people or the risk across the world of different people. So we have to retool that. And I think the whole idea of just transition and just economics and just gender justice are critical pillars for how we move forward. Because the COVID-19 is not just an anomaly. It's pointing to the pernicious and tenacious long-standing global inequality. And it's revealing glaringly the inequalities and the weaknesses of the exploitative system and societal models that currently bake in society. How do we shift that? Many different ways. It is great to see, and I do welcome that the IMF and the G20 and the G7 have actually proposed and are implementing $650 billion in SDRs, which many pundits celebrate as a historical development, the first time the IMF has done such a gender thing. But let's be also mindful of the realities that this new $650 billion equivalent, most of that is going to the wealthier countries. 68% is going to the G20, for almost 40% to G7. And the African countries are getting nearly 5% of SDRs. While that may be a boost to developing countries in terms of helping to fix some of the financing gap, it is not going to resolve many issues. And the idea that that's been mooted, that the government, the G20 governments can maybe donate 60 to 100 billions of their allotment for things like vaccine and other kinds of things, I don't find that as celebratory. These SDRs are needed and are very important. Well, we have pre-existing structural issues and we have COVID issues, COVID recovery. Vaccine should not be even on the discussion about using SDR. Vaccine should have been covered already as a solidarity, global solidarity, human rights event. Under COVAX, the US, all of these governments should have already put money for vaccine. ODA should cover some of those kinds of things. Climate is not. Many of us were hoping that the IMF and not the IMF, but the G20 and the G7 would have actually also thought about setting aside a trust fund for dealing with climate, because $100 billion on the table is woefully inadequate, will not do anything. And even if we accept the OECD report that about 80 billion of it has been already dispersed, which many of us question, certainly many developing countries, certainly many researchers question, most of what has been on the table has been loans for adaptation and so forth. So there's a lot of issues that needs to be discussed. And the idea being proposed that the IMF could possibly create, the IMF itself has mooted that it would like to create a resilient fund, a resilient trust fund, while a good idea may not be sufficient enough to carry us on a transformative pathway towards where we need to go. Because lots of the discussion about the donation of those money may be involving conditionalities and other kinds of things that we would not like to see. We have been through rounds of global crisis where the management of that crisis got us into systems where developing countries, health systems have been disseminated, basic services have been disseminated because of IMF structural adjustment program. So we would not like to see portions of SDR become part of the poverty reduction growth program and other kinds of programs structured around conditionalities and so forth. So that's not a transformative way. A transformative way would be, I think, to first of all build whatever we're doing on human rights, gender justice, and also climate. We know that COVID has not ceased the continuing rise in emission. The IEA has just projected that the 380 billion of recovery, that of the money that was spent for recovery, only about 380 billion of this have been proposed for clean energy. In those recovery plans that I've looked at, I've examined those recovery plans, tree planting is predominant. Not much, if any, about gender, getting money to community groups and women's on the ground, and getting money to rebuild health systems in a way that's climate resilient and adaptive. So we need to really look at what it is that we're doing and what is the ambition in these policies. Where is the ambitious social safety net? Where is the basic income guarantee? These are all things that we need to build if we want to move forward. These are just building foundation. They're not even the ambitious part of it. These are the buildings, the fundamental things: access to clean water, clean energy, equitable care provisions. We've seen what has happened to women and is happening to women with the COVID pandemic. So I think we need to go back to some basic fundamentals around providing social policy and social care. And the risk have to be analyzed, not just from the perspective of stranded assets of financial institutions, but what's about the stranded impact and devastation of the lives of men and women in community. I will stop there because I think we have many more things to talk about, such as what are the barriers to us getting there? And I'd like to hear my fellow panelists on this.
Thank you very much, Mariama. Really strong words there, and rightfully so. And we look forward to further discussion later of all of those points. Now we'll turn to our second presenter, our author, Chenai Chair. Chenai is Special Advisor on Africa Innovation at Mozilla Foundation and author of the study in our series entitled, Does Data Protection Safeguard Against Gender-Based Risks in Southern Africa? She is an expert on the intersection of digital technology and gender. She has built her expertise with extensive experience focusing on understanding the impact of technology in society through research and public policy assessment. She is currently a member of the Internet Governance Forum's Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group and a steering committee member for the Center for International Governance Innovation's work on assessing online gender-based violence. Chenai, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Viola, and good day to my fellow panelists and everyone who is joining the conversation. It's such an honor to be able to share a topic that's close to my heart. That I've been working on for, I think, a year, but I've always been thinking about the digital divide from the digital access from a gender perspective. So I had the opportunity to actually unpack issues around data protection in relation to whether they actually the current regulations can address gender-based harms. And this really stems from the conversations that we've had in thinking about data in the context where data is often attributed to being an economic gain. You know, everybody has to have control so that we can leverage the ability to connect with each other at different global levels. So in this specific context, I was looking at Southern Africa, which has had support from the European Union and International Telecommunications Union in order to develop its SADC model law, which then other countries can build up from in terms of developing their own data protection laws. And in this instance, what really is of context or key within the multilateral model is just really thinking about Europe being seen as setting the gold standard when it comes to data protection, and then countries developing from their own national policies that would allow for them to adapt to the European standard of data protection, but context is not really taken into account. So in the work that I did in terms of like just nuancing the power dynamics and really understanding the issues at hand from a gender-based perspective, it was really unpacking that idea of data as really a concern for women and gender diverse people because of the links to surveillance and how surveillance has always been a patriarchal tool of control. Most of the times the conversations or the regulations that we have in place are to protect from a business to user perspective, or not so much as a government, but not even thinking about like the levels of surveillance at a community level. So the work that I did when I was unpacking the extent to which comparing the GDPR and SADC model law, the extent to which they just engage with gender, one would find that like both laws do take a look at sex life and sexual orientation. These are protected categories that do have grounds for when they can be processed, right? And this for me was the point where I placed it in that context of like, if they can be processed, are these laws actually taking into account the context of inequalities that are already existent in the societies that they're being implemented? And it was interesting for me as well to think about it from perspective that gender is not engaged with in the GDPR. It's only sex life and sexual orientation. And that's something of like concern because gender is a social construct that has an impact on which the way data is actually processed and how one does experience technology that makes use of data. Whereas for the SADC model law, gender is included, like it's spoken about, but it's not really unpacked. So in this instance, one can see that the right language is being used, but it's not being critically assessed in terms of how it actually has an impact. And I think in this work, what was really quite interesting was the fact that within the SADC model law, there's actually a clause that does allow for the processing of sex life and sexual orientation on the grounds that if the behavior is considered deviant, then that means that one can be able to process it. Now, this is the part where, the context around multilateralism and just not unpacking context comes into place, because within SADC, the SADC region, or actually within Africa, a lot of same-sex practices are actually criminalized. And currently, right now, we know that in Ghana, there's actually a bill that's currently being debated around like protecting the family and criminalizing same-sex acts. And then also, in addition to that, we know that like sex work is also quite problematic. It's also criminalized. So if anyone does use the digital space in order for them to conduct any sex work, they could be flagged. And this then can be built on around that, like processing that data by any other institution because their practice is considered deviant. So for my work, having like located some of these challenges and the fact that this is something that's actually in a model law that is being processed and people can build up on it, it actually raises the flag of like, if this law was developed with support from a European Union and International Telecommunications Union support, how come it has not been interrogated, given that these are some of the area categories that are protected within those contexts, but at the same time, it hasn't been dealt with in a way that would allow for, if anyone was to make use of the SADC model law, in developing data protection laws, or actually in making them better for the ones that we currently have, this is something that could be taken into account and be problematic for gender diverse people, women, and anyone who doesn't fit into the box. So I think overall, just like to round up and focus on like recommendations and the importance of taking gender into account and sexuality, by nuancing the issues around gender and sexuality, what it really does is affirm some of the work that had been done by the Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy on how gender is considered a secondary issue when it comes to data protection. And there's a need for us to have people who actually do understand the injustices associated with gender and sexuality to be part of the lawmaking process, and for it to have that conversation in terms of like within a multilateral space of context and actually unpacking collaborations around conversations on what have been some of the interventions to ensure protection for gender and sexual diverse people within like a European context when perhaps this is protected, but then thinking about it within a Southern Africa context where there is this advocacy to ensure that there's a support for policy development so that they can be like equal engagement on data issues, but what happens when it's actually not dealing with specific gender issues in particular, because we know of the related gender inequality. So just to close off on the point, there is some promising work that's been done in terms of like being able to fund people, because I think one of the key things that's missing is actually research on these issues in order for there to be more evidence-based policy making and for there to be more challenges around these kinds of laws. So it's quite important for us to be able to fund, to have a space where, although it's multilateral, there are more voices at the table who are actually able to critique and contribute to these conversations, in particular civil society, that can hold policymakers and people who write the law accountable for some of the language that's allowed to exist in these documents. And I'll hand it back over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Chennai. That was really interesting and a lot for us to address when we get to the discussion part. The next speaker that we have coming up, another of our authors, Harjit Singh, is Senior Advisor for Climate Impacts at Climate Action Network in Delhi, India, and author of the study in our series entitled Artificial Distinction Between Climate Change Adaptation and Development Restricts Access to Climate Finance for Developing Countries. He also provides strategic advice on global partnerships to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and until recently has led Action Aid International's climate change work globally. He is a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, and has co-founded Satat Sampada, a social enterprise that promotes sustainable and environmental solutions such as organic food and farming in India and beyond. Harjit, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And thanks to Heinrich-Böll for giving the opportunity to contribute to this series and inviting me to share some of the highlights from that paper. It has been such a pleasure, and I would like to recognize my co-author, Indrajit Bose from Third World Network, who I loved working with on this piece. My co-panelists have set the context so well, and we all know the multiple crises that we are facing. And when we talk about climate change, the effect of climate change are increasingly clear around the world. The reality is that developing countries, especially the poor, are bearing the brunt. And women and girls are especially impacted by climate change, and this is likely to worsen in the future. And we all know how climate change violate human rights such as right to life, health, food, and an adequate standard of living. While we are already facing climate emergency, it is so unfortunate that at the multilateral level, there's a fight over what is adaptation, what is development, and so that the money that is supposed to be going to the developing countries to protect themselves, the poor communities to safeguard, is not reaching because of the so-called confusion around the concepts of adaptation and development. So this paper goes a little deep into that, and I'm going to share a few highlights. From our perspective, it is wrong at 3 levels: technical, moral, and political. The first thing that the global community has to recognize that it's the political failure that has led to this situation. And we are living in more than 1 degree warmer world, and the devastating impacts that people are facing around the world, and particularly poor communities who have least role to cause in causing the problem. And the way temperature is rising and the way rich countries in particular continue to evade their responsibility, it's quite possible that 1.5 degree is out of reach. In that situation, developing countries who are facing more and more impacts, a lot of their investment is already going in scaling up adaptation. They're already facing loss and damage. And not only economic impacts, but also non-economic impacts, which we seldom talk about. Let's recognize the loss of culture that is happening because of these devastating impacts, loss of language. Their religious and burial sites are now being abandoned in many places, and they will not have access to those sites. The kind of emotional impact it puts on communities, it just cannot be explained. Now, coming to the technical level, we know that many funding agencies and the multilateral institutions have limited their funding in the name of incremental cost that they're going to provide when it comes to climate adaptation. We need to understand that when we have to measure what is adaptation, it is still possible to do that when it comes to infrastructure. But it's very hard when we look at the software elements of adaptation. You talk about capacity building or strengthening governance systems or streamlining policies or public awareness, education, research. It's really hard. And this is where when you try to distinguish between development and adaptation, it is absolutely unfair for countries who have huge development deficit that goes for decades and centuries for various reasons, which I'm going to talk about. As civil society, as developing countries, we also had put forward the demand of new and additional finance for adaptation. But that also has not been met, and those calls have been ignored. So in reality, the same ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, is being diverted towards climate. And as part of climate finance, where development has to be the base or the foundation for that adaptation work, is now being questioned by the same donors who have simply diverted the aid instead of providing new and additional. Now, that also puts the whole moral question of why this artificial distinction is absolutely unfair. The current situation is that the principles of equity and justice, which are at the heart of climate action and climate justice, have been ignored. We have been calling for adaptation to be treated as at par with mitigation, but in reality, only about 25% of money is going to adaptation, and as per the recent study by Oxfam. So, on one hand, communities are suffering. They are not able to prepare for the future disasters, and they're already facing loss and damage. So this is the reality that has been created because of the inaction over the last 30 years, and many of the impacts that communities are facing because they were not provided enough resources in time. And so politically and morally, it is incorrect to now talk about the development deficit, and saying that it is responsibility of the national governments is absolutely unfair. How about the delay that has happened over the last 30 years of not providing enough resources for communities to prepare for these disasters? Who's going to pay for such a delay that has happened, and communities and countries have lost so much of resources and infrastructure to increasing number of disasters? It is also important to look at some of the historical injustices which are not talked about. As when we talk about climate change, we do not recognize that how colonization, genocide, racism, slavery that paved the way for industrialization and massive land use change, which are responsible for the crisis that we are facing, and the kind of resources that have been sucked from countries. Coming from India, I can tell you from the subcontinent, there's a recent study in 2018 that calculated that $45 trillion, it's a conservative estimate at current rates, was drained from the Indian subcontinent by Britain from 1765 to 1938. And I think it's important to know that India's share of the world economy fell from 23% to below 4% by the time British left. And these are the hard numbers that we need to look at when we talk about where countries stand and where they were. And same is valid for other colonies and regions where resources have been looted and extracted at a massive scale. So clearly it's not fair to get into these distinctions when the global community has not been looking at the historical injustices and not meeting their responsibility. If we really want multilateralism to work, we have to go beyond that. And I'm going to just quickly share a couple of recommendations that we have in the paper. So instead of fighting, for those little resources that have been put on the table, we know that demand has been for $100 billion, which itself is a drop in the ocean. All indications are that we need billions of dollars. United Nations Environment Program said we need $300 billion just for adaptation by 2030 and $500 billion by 2050. That's the number we are talking about. So even the $100 billion which was committed and that commitment has not been met is absolutely insufficient. So we have to scale up resources instead of doing this kind of nitpicking. We have to stop the counterproductive separation of development and adaptation, particularly at the local level. People who are living one life, their life cannot be divided into those silos. We have to facilitate access to adaptation finance for developing countries. Yes, we need a framework that defines adaptation. We are not saying that all development needs to be or should be repackaged as adaptation. So we need a framework, and we have to focus on efforts so that developing countries can mainstream adaptation and climate-proof development. Now, apart from that, we also have to recognize that how lack of adaptation violates human rights and how those measures need to respect, protect, and promote human rights, and particularly support the voice and agency of women and girls in the adaptation action. And overall, what we find that the accountability of the multilateralism is missing, and that needs to be urgently strengthened to hold polluters to account who are responsible for the crisis and whose responsibility is very much enshrined in the convention as well as in the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Ajit, thank you so much for those very, very important words, and add very much to our conversation coming up now, in fact, with Heidi Hautala and Katrina Fotovat and Monica Iyer. Heidi is a Finnish member of the European Parliament representing the Greens in the European Free Alliance and is Vice President of the European Parliament. In the current term, she serves as a member of the Committee on International Trade and of the Subcommittee on Human Rights. Katrina Fotovat is the senior official in the U.S. State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues in Washington, D.C. There, she leads a team of gender experts promoting gender equality efforts, including support of women, peace and security, countering violent extremism, promoting women's economic empowerment, and combating gender-based violence. Katrina has over 20 years of experience advocating gender and human rights globally, specifically in conflict and post-conflict settings. Monica Iyer is the Human Rights Officer in the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She works on issues related to migration and related to the environment and climate change, and coordinates a project on climate-related migration in the Sahel. Within the office, she has also supported the mandates of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and the Independent Expert on Human Rights and International Solidarity. Thank you, Heidi, Katrina, and Monica for being with us. So I want to start with referring back to Mariama's points. As we noted that the title of her paper is Just and Sustainable Finance to Address Multiple Global Crises, demands a focus on gender equality. She calls for a systemic approach via feminist Green New Deal, clearly defined, transparent, and adequate climate financing, and revitalization of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. She noted today that human rights and justice are not as deeply embedded as we had hoped, and huge disparities in power, influence, access, and funding. Heidi, I want to start with you. Do you think world leaders are politically ready to take such ambitious approaches as many of our speakers, all of our speakers are calling for today? And if so, what gives you the confidence that they are ready? If not, what do you think we need to do to get there?
Oh, am I now on mute?
Katie?
Yeah, yes.
We can hear you now.
Yeah, thank
you.
you. Yeah, I was thrilled to study the three presentations and the papers. They are all interlinked, of course, in this multilateral context that we need to discuss. And I believe very much that we have more and more evidence that, let's say, the time window is open for another 10 years, during which we have to enter into this transformative pathway that Mariama Williams is talking about. And I hope, of course, that the Glasgow COP26 could be a kind of a big milestone here, that finally more and more governments, first of all, they start to explain how they are going to fulfill their commitments. And secondly, that they explain how they are going to channel these resources through the multilateral institutions to make them able to meet the needs. And I think it's become extremely clear from also from the presentation of Harjeet, if I can raise that into the same discussion, that there needs to be much more money. But let me also point out that we need a transformation of trade policies so that we can combine free trade with sustainability. And this is one of the major discussions in the European Parliament these days and in the EU. How can we have enforceable sustainable development chapters in our trade agreements, which take into account social, environmental, and governance aspects?
Thank you very much. I do also want to give an opportunity for Haiti for Monica or Katrina to weigh in on that particular question, if either of you would want to add something. Otherwise, we can go on to another question. Okay, so one of the questions that comes to my mind about all of these presentations is, what is the single biggest political obstacle to pursuing such transformational change, and how might leaders overcome that obstacle? Monica, I think you probably encountered some of these issues in the course of your work, and what are you finding as the big obstacle to transformational change?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question. I do want to take a minute, since I'm taking the floor for the first time, to thank the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for this whole incredible series and the authors of the three papers today for the really interesting papers that they put forward. I mean, I think the single biggest obstacle is the entrenched systems that we have of power in the global system, and the people's inability and really lack of interest in breaking out of those systems of power and giving power to, in particular, affected communities. And we see this in both in all of I think this is a common thread running through all of the papers that we're discussing today, is that in order to achieve transformational change, what we need to be doing most is listening to and giving leadership opportunities, getting out of the way for the leadership of affected communities. And there's an unwillingness to do that we need to overcome.
It's a really interesting point, to just simply get out of the way of the people who need to have a voice in all of these discussions. Thank you very much for that, Monica. When we look at some of the points that Chennai made. The title of her paper, again, was Just and Sustainable Finance to Address Multiple Global Crises Demands a Focus on Gender Equality. She says African leaders, quote, question the extent of their influence and the meaningfulness of their involvement in these mechanisms, unquote. And that gets back to Monica's point that you made just now. Chennai also raises alarms about the dangerous gaps in digital governance that place women and gender diverse people at risk. She mentioned today the great concern of women in regards to data because of the ubiquity of surveillance at a community level and the importance of model laws in setting examples for better or worse, hopefully for the better. Katrina, I wanted to ask you in reference to this, what promising work do you see happening to address the issue of differential impacts of data and digital governance and regulation based on gender?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you all so much for having us here today. And really, to the authors and presenters, thank you so much for your important work. And again, many thanks to my esteemed panelists as well. Certainly the gender digital divide and the challenges women and girls face in the digital environment pose a threat to economic, social, and political progress. Restrictive social norms we have seen in structural inequalities offline and online contribute to gender-based violence, discrimination, and harassment across the board. So globally, this exacerbates the gender digital divide and really threatens human rights and women's rights. The United States will continue to make it a priority to invest in digital access and literacy for women and girls in order to ensure their meaningful participation in the interconnected public sphere. The Gender White House Policy Council is working to combat systematic bias and discrimination. President Biden put into effect on March 8th of this year a mandate to create a White House Gender Policy Council, which is the highest level gender policy council that we've had. And it includes addressing and combating systematic bias and discrimination, including sexual harassment online. This will extend to harassment in online spaces and will incorporate into our forthcoming U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. Additionally, we're looking at doing a national action plan on gender-based violence online, as well as just in general. And we're hoping to get other countries to commit to that effort as well.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Katrina. Appreciate that. I wanted to stay with you for a moment and ask you in relation to Harjeet's paper, for example, artificial distinction between climate change adaptation and development, restricting access to climate finance for developing countries. He said today, mentioned the devastating non-economic impacts, not only economic, and the problems of calibrating funding and policy and development deficits that countries are grappling with. In his paper, he said the international community should focus on climate-proofing development projects, frameworks, and systems, respecting and protecting human rights, encouraging participation, and accounting for the disproportionate effects of climate change on women and girls. Kat, what do you see as the single most innovative approach to addressing disproportionate effects in any sphere related to the disproportionate effects on women and girls? And what are the obstacles to taking that to scale?
Sure, thank you. Well, first and foremost, it is imperative that women and girls be empowered as leaders locally and internationally in combating the climate crisis in their own communities and on a national scale. Based on traditional roles and responsibilities, many parts of the world, women and girls have a unique relationship with their communities and the environment, making them uniquely poised to develop locally relevant, meaningful, more effective solutions to the climate challenges faced by their communities. So by facilitating and amplifying their solutions, not only will disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis on women and girls be addressed, but all of society benefits as well. We have seen many strategies for ensuring local women and girls are leaders in solving the climate crisis, but one that should not be understated is the importance of engaging and empowering them locally. Women's at risk and other grassroots organizations that have a firm understanding of their local community needs, and they maintain long-standing relationships with women and girls and comprehend opportunities and challenges that exist on the ground. So a gender perspective really needs to be taken into account when developing resource mobilization. So one of the challenges or main challenges is obviously resource mobilization. And we need to take that into consideration for strategies, applying climate finance instruments, and ensuring equal participation in the deployment of financial resources, particularly at the local level. Some examples where gender should be included is in the climate financing initiatives, such as the Green Climate Fund. President Biden has mandated gender budgeting as part of our budget planning processes, which should push for a more inclusive approach to combating issues such as climate change. There has been a push also in multilateral commitments to include a gender lens. However, the implementation is often lagging. For example, as noted in your report, the Paris Agreement also mandates gender responsive adaptation and capacity building efforts, but really fails to integrate gender specific language into its mitigation, technology, or finance sections. So gender responsive climate financing instruments and funding allocations really are needed. And that way we can make sure that the public funding and efforts are more contributed in an equitable, efficient, and effective way.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Monica and Heidi, did you have any thoughts on that particular point? That is, what have you seen in your vast experience of as an innovative approach to addressing these disproportionate effects on women and girls? And what do you see as the obstacles to taking those innovations to scale?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on this question because I think it's
great. Thank you.
It's a really, I appreciate very much the positive framing of the question and the search for innovation, but I want to build on what Katrina just said and emphasize that even as we're searching for innovative solutions, we don't have down the very boring and basic solutions to trying to make sure that climate finance and adaptation and mitigation measures are gender responsive and human rights based. And what we need to ensure that every single climate project includes environmental and social safeguards, includes human rights-based due diligence, includes gender responsiveness, fundamentally not as lip service, not as not as additional, but as a fundamental element of every single project that's undertaken, and that they all include meaningful consultation with affected communities that are gender responsive. And we can be searching for innovative methods while we're doing that, but we need to take care of those basics across the board. And I also think that because we're not taking care of the basics, sometimes our bar for innovation is kind of low. You see projects being labeled as innovative just because they're doing the things that we should have been doing all along, like actually giving women economic opportunities, or actually listening to and incorporating and making space for traditional knowledge of Indigenous communities. And it's really, really good that there are projects that are doing that, and we need more and more and more. But we also need to maybe think about, have a higher bar for what we set for what we think about as innovative. I think there are a few things that are really innovative that do actually seek to address sort of underserved problems or under-recognized problems, like, for example, menstrual health or maternal health, while at the same time addressing climate change. And I feel like I've said a lot right now, so I will leave the second half of the question perhaps for later or for others to answer.
That was a really important point, Monica. So thank you very much for making that point about getting back to the basics. Thank you. Heidi, did you have any thoughts about this issue of innovation, taking to scale, or getting back to the basics, as Monica mentioned?
Yes, I think to bring women to the negotiation tables when development, adaptation, climate change, all these aspects are discussed in a coherent and integrated way. So I would say that we need a lot of innovations about integrated look at various challenges that we have. And I would also think that it's these days really important that women are making these voices heard as representing their governments in negotiations, for instance, climate negotiations. And the Finnish government has somehow also made this happen through earmarking support for developing countries to specially engage women in those processes. But I think every development project, every climate project should be both gender and climate proofed. So we can't anymore afford looking at just one thing and forget the other. So in a summary, I think we need to get out of the silos. We need to come into a truly integrated approach also when talking about implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But of course, it's very important to find ways to empower women in their communities. And talking about innovations, I think it's not really new, but it's something which is a battlefield in many countries, that to try to find ways to support women's sexual and reproductive rights is really important for communal development and development of all societies. Let me also come back to Harjeet's speech. I thank him very much for raising these historical injustices. And actually these injustices, obviously, they continue today. And there's one innovative way to address these injustices is through corporate accountability. And I'm happy to say that we in the European Parliament are in the forefront, and the EU is trying to put in place mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation for companies. Because as we speak about financing, we should not let the private sector go without any accountability. And the private sector has a huge accountability and responsibility in making sure that we as consumers of the wealthy countries, that we do not continue to overexploit our common natural resources and worsening the climate change. So I guess this is really something that it could become a global standard as well. I believe that the EU has a transformative power with its European Green Deal, which has also had impact in other countries already through trade policies, and this corporate accountability is one way where the European Union is trying to implement the external dimension of its Green Deal, also to correct the historical injustices.
Thank you very much, Heidi. That's really important points. I wanted to follow up a little bit about what you mentioned related to the difficulty of making sure that women are at these negotiating tables. And I would welcome any thoughts from Katrina or Monica on this as well, or from our authors. But Heidi, just let me start with you. What do you think what are the obstacles to ensuring that more women are at these negotiating tables?
Well, as a policymaker and politician, I believe that it goes to the patriarchal domination in our political systems, in political parties, but there's a way. I think there's a way to show that without the full incorporation of women into all international negotiations, national as well, of course, into peace negotiations, that we see a more complete world, because with women's eyes, it looks different. And I think there's been a lot of progress in this field. And let me just say that this morning we had a closed meeting with some members of parliament from Afghanistan, who now had against their will to move abroad. And it's a very sorry situation that with the US sudden departure from Afghanistan, we have left these women politicians, journalists that we have tried to empower to take a public role against the most conservative elements of their societies, and now facing this terrible threat from Taliban, which is coming every day to them. So I think the United States and its allies bear a huge responsibility of what is happening now, and we cannot leave them behind. So women who have been brought to public offices and to use their freedom of expression must be protected. So that's it's very topical, very urgent to do that.
Thank you very much for that. Monica, Katrina, did either of you want to add anything on that issue of involving women in negotiations and making sure that they are at the table?
I'm happy to chime in. So the Women, Peace and Security Act of 2019 that the United States passed really focuses on the participation of women in peace building and leadership efforts. And it's the implementation of 1325 within the United States efforts overseas as well as internally. So we have an interagency effort to make sure that women are included, that they are empowered. And I couldn't agree with Heidi more in terms of looking at Afghanistan, making sure that the women leaders there that we have been working with are protected. And obviously the United States is not a monolith. I have very strong feelings on this. I do believe that we need to make sure that women are empowered. We know that when women are at the negotiating table for peace negotiations last, peace treaties last 15 years longer. We know that when women are brought to the table, if we're talking about public-private partnerships and partnering with the private sector, again, that business case can be made to show how work is much more efficient and equitable, and making sure that women are brought to these tables is absolutely imperative in making sure that communities move forward, economies move forward, are more productive. So we have taken a very proactive stance on women, peace, and security efforts. And that includes women's leadership in areas including climate change, including gender-based violence, and including the tech sector as well.
Thank you, Katrina. Harjeet and Chennai and Mariama, would you like to take a stab at these questions of involving women and girls?
Well,
yes,
I want to make a couple of interventions, because I think while it's definitely the case that a lot more can be done at national, local levels for enhancing and empowering women and girls, and in general people at the bottom of the pyramid to live better lives and have better access to resources. I think the problem, though, is not simply at that level. I think since we're in the context of talking about multilateralism, when we look at the drivers behind the situations that create problems on the ground across all levels, take peace and security, we need to look at what's driving conflict. What are the biggest global trade for the big countries? Weapons. Okay. And until we address those, we could change all the rules we want about women at the table and so forth. The conflicts and the wars, if we look at what has happened in the last 30 years, peace and security, those have to be addressed at systematic and structural level as well. And we cannot fudge that over and simply go to looking at women at the table. That's important, but the overriding conditions have to change. If we look at trade, I said, there's no such thing as free trade. So let's drop that word. What we have is managed trade. And even more so than ever the last 10 years, we've seen that it is managed trade. And particularly when you come to COVID vaccine, we see that intellectual property rights and the corporate driven profit making is given primacy over the lives of people in developing countries. So talking about a temporary trip waiver is a very minimal solution. We need structurally to adjust intellectual property and its impact on health, digitalization, and the whole idea of the fourth revolution. Where does that leave developing countries? And in particular, where does that leave the women in developing countries? So we can fix all we want at the little potholes. But what's creating the potholes and what's creating the problems for people like? If we take climate change, it's been 30 years that we've been discussing at a multilateral level climate change. And we have not managed to bend the emissions curve. And though the great talk about COVID doing that, we see that COVID, the IEA is saying that we're going to have a rapid rise in emission by 2023. So we're off track on all of these global issues. And I think we need to go back. We need to really pull together to see where is multilateralism? Where is multilateralism when the COVID broke out? Did countries get together to talk about how to deal with it? No, everybody went off on their own ways. They raised barriers, they stopped trade. Nobody talked about how to do this in a manner that would be equitable, that would be protective of women and girls. Now the solutions for COVID and the COVID recovery are being proposed, but the discussion is not about how to prevent further poverty, marginalization, how to protect women, how to enhance women's rights. It's about how even you see proposals now being made by UNDP of all, talking about using the unused SDR to leverage the capital markets. Okay. In climate change, the problem of adaptation is occurring because for 30 years we haven't fixed the problem. Emissions been rising. Adaptation becomes even more challenging. And then we say about adaptation and development and all the issues that Arjita has brought up. So I think we really need to have some systematic engagement about some of the superstructural issue, the macro issue, as well as the meta and the micro issue. That needs to be a conversation that interlink those together. And I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you very much, Mariama. There's really, really important points. Harshit, would you like to say a few words on this point?
Well, after Mariama's intervention, nothing is left to add, but to only stress that the current multilateral system is maintaining the unequal power system and further perpetuating inequality, whether it's economic, social, environmental. And we need to revamp the whole notion of multilateralism. Is it to maintain that power system, or we really are genuinely serious about the transformation that we keep talking about? And unless we do that, and we have been saying, the underlying causes of all the crises are same, and those drivers that Mariama talked about, I think it's extremely important to put a spotlight on those drivers. As you know, Heidi said about trade, that's one part of it, part of the story, a big part of the story. But then there are kind of political support that these corporations get. I think we need to expose that as well. So there are real fundamental issues that we need to talk about. Otherwise, 10 years later, we'll be still talking about those challenges, and challenges getting far more complex than resolved.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harshit. Chennai, would you like to make a few points on this?
Yeah, so I'm going to build up on another aspect together with the underlying issues, but to really think about, like your question was, the barriers to the table, but is the table inviting enough, or is it a safe space enough for women and girls to actually want to participate? Right. And I think this allows for us to be quite critical of multilateral systems that then do focus on building up spaces for empowerment, building up spaces for funding towards addressing particular issues, when actually the power dynamics that underlie these conversations actually limit the extent to which one can participate. So if you're, say, for example, hypothetically, one is invited to engage on issues around data, and they're basically saying that what if we worked towards an example of, say, for example, the Feminist Manifesto No, which actually is saying I don't want to be part of the data ecosystem. However, if the conversation around the table is like, let's ensure that everybody is able to use data or has some sense of ownership, or it's around like participating in that ecosystem, what we've basically done is you can only participate if you fit into a particular box, which is one of the criticisms that I've always had about the way in which we often frame the conversations around like development and, the example that I've given around like the SADC model law and its support that it got from the European Union and ITU, the focus was on ensuring that there is a law that works without really nuancing the gender issues that are there. So I guess my intervention is really being critical of the kind of table that we want people to attend and be part of. And is there space for someone to have a different opinion and still be fostered in their difference? And is there room for that engagement that is much more critical and aware of power dynamics that have also existed in, say, for example, colonial contexts, because that's something that's still engaged with, especially within like the digital space around decolonizing the way in which we often engage on these particular issues. So I do think that together with the systems, it's really about, have we created a context that does allow for women and girls to participate fully as who they are, not necessarily fitting into a particular box.
Thank you very much, Chennai. I do want to turn to audience Q&A very quickly now, because we are, as always, running out of time, but those were really important interventions and very much appreciated. I want to turn back to our panel now of policymakers and experts and start with a couple of the audience questions. I think some of them have already been addressed to a certain extent, but I do want to get a few in there. For Heidi, we have a question from someone who is not identified specifically here, but it says, unfortunately, it does not look like COP26 will be the milestone which you talked about. Access for civil society actors from, quote, red list countries is very difficult. Visas, vaccines, quarantine costs, etc. And climate finance does not seem to be a priority either. If you read the different COP preparatory documents carefully, what are the strategies to still make COP26 a milestone now? We would love to hear your thoughts on that, Heidi.
Yes, yeah, sure. I wasn't aware of these particular difficulties, but maybe there's still time to try to alleviate them. And obviously, it will be also something where remote formats like this one can to some extent be utilized, but of course it will never be the same as these lively civil society gatherings, side events around these climate conferences. So thank you for informing me about this. I mean, I'm not a key decision maker here. Climate change is not my key issue. I'm more working on the corporate accountability. And I must say that I really think that it's important to incorporate both trade policy and also the corporate accountability issue to the climate issue, because as Harjeet has said, we still have these supports for very regressive companies, big multinationals that are destroying our common goods, the global commons, the climate, biodiversity, creating poverty. So all these aspects also must be brought to the discussions in and around. I'm very curious about this initiative of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This corresponds a little bit to our green efforts in the European Parliament to show that we need to do away with this International Energy Charter Treaty, where European plus countries are members, and which do not stop fossil fuels, and which make those who produce fossil fuels particularly protected. So there's a lot of things that need to be done at structural level indeed. This all could be a part of the climate discussions, and it should, of course, be as inclusive as possible. Let's hope that we are able to find ways to do away with these obstacles that you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Haiti. And would anyone else like to weigh in on that, either Monica or Katrina or any of the authors? Okay, then I'll move on to another of the questions here, and this is one addressed to any of the authors or panelists. From Thokozile Madonko, probably one to be addressed by all. It says, I am curious if we're circling around the big elephant in this virtual room. The question seems to be, how do we calibrate multilateralism to truly address the ills of the current global economic system that disproportionately benefits corporations and their elites, and the expense of each theme discussed? I think to some extent we've covered that, but does anyone want to say anything more about that issue of recalibrating multilateralism to address the global economic system?
I can say a line or two. As you said, a lot has been covered. We are going towards the COP, and we know that this particular COP26 is happening in the backdrop of global inequality or vaccine inequality that we have seen. Which means, and we all know that it's the economic system that is behind this inequity and inequality that we are facing around the world. And when it comes to climate, the data is very clear. It's 100 companies that are responsible for over 70% of emissions. So clearly, this is the economic system that is responsible for the crisis. And what these corporations have done, they have put the onus on individuals and telling them to calculate their carbon footprint and spend their life only questioning themselves than questioning them. I'm not saying that individuals should not be careful about the kind of lifestyle they're living. We must be. But what are those systems that are going to enable a sustainable lifestyle? It's very easy now, especially to point towards developing economies who are just industrializing without providing them enough support to help transform those economies by providing finance and technology. So, and they are being forced to adopt the same economic model copied from the West, which is responsible for the crisis. So we have to put a spotlight on that economic system that has created the problem. And that's why you hear some of us and activists talking about system change, not climate change. So that system part has to be put right at the center of our discussions.
Thank you very much, Rashid.
Yeah, I fully agree with Rashid. I think it's, corporations are entities that operate at the benevolence of governments and even us as citizens. The system, the economic system, is the primary barrier to achieving justice and sustainability. I mean, the economic system depends on non-renewable resource. It is driven by rampant greed and accumulation and extractivism. And there's also a shortfall in democracy wherever you look. We have the rise of neopopulism, we have rhetorics about gender, and we have rhetorics about financial inclusion. But when you get to the point where the actions are taken, they're very minimal and they're very incremental, to say the least. So we can fix some of these issues around corporate. The whole idea of corporate social responsibility, it should be discarded. I think we need enforceable rules of dealing with corporations just the way we had before in many different societies. We even had the UN Center on Transnational Cooperation that the corporations themselves worked with governments to get rid of. So voluntary, we've had that for 20 years. What has it gotten us? Okay, during the pandemic, the richest 1% got more richer than anything. I think we need to go back to a whole new set of social contract that's put people and planet at the center of macroeconomic policy. And so we need to do that. We have the OECD discussion going on around global taxation, of digital economy. These are the firms that have made the more money out of the global pandemics. Yet they are the ones that are the most untouchable for taxes. So we have mechanisms in the system that we can deal with. Trade rules favor corporations. The corporations are the ones that put the intellectual property rights in. If you talk to Monsanto and them in the agricultural agreement, they didn't just do this by themselves. They have the complicity of our governments and our leaders. And so democracy is problematic, and the economic system has been problematic, and the ability to rein the corporations in are there, and it's for our governments and for us to change the rules and the dynamics which have gone out of balance in favor of corporate and the high net worth individuals. And these are what we're seeing with COVID, and more pandemics will create more of the same unless we start doing something about that. And the gentleman is right, we're circling around it, but it's not just corporations, it's an economic system, and it's democracy that's in peril, whatever we want to say with that word. And so we need to address those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariama. We are quickly running out of time, but I do want to get to one of the other audience questions. And Monica, I'm going to direct this one to you to see your thoughts on this. This is from Julia Perrier, an Argentinian journalist. What do you think of the fact that many rich countries are about to administer a third COVID-19 vaccine dose, while African and poorer countries have not received their vaccines yet?
Yeah, I mean, I doubt my thoughts are going to come as much of a surprise to anyone. I think this has been discussed already in a few of the other interventions already today, but we have completely failed to address the systemic inequalities in vaccine distribution. The failure to, as Mariama said, at least adopt a temporary solution, such as the TRIPS waiver, the failure to adopt even these really fully commit to what's needed for initiatives like COVAX we need to do better. That's plain and simple.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to just have a few closing remarks from Heidi and from Katrina and Monica before we unfortunately have to wrap this up. So Heidi, if you have any final thoughts for us as we
thank you. I think this has been a very useful discussion, saying that we need to put the spotlight on the drivers of all these inequalities and injustices, global challenges that we have. And it is indeed the economic system. And I couldn't agree more with Mariama Williams, who maybe thought that I was thinking about some voluntary, almost like charity type of corporate social responsibility. I was not. I'm talking about enforceable, legally obligatory, mandatory rules that are now being very seriously coming up in the European Union. And this could become a basis for a global standard because companies are working worldwide. So I trust that this could be one of the drivers of a systemic change to make corporations accountable. And then I believe that the issue of global taxation is really important. And there was a question about if the EU is now underway, as it plans, to introduce a kind of a carbon border adjustment mechanism to tax companies that import high carbon content steel and other commodities to the EU, how to make it just for the poorest in the world. I think we need to have serious instruments to combat climate change, and global floor price or tax for carbon is definitely one that needs to be set. But then we need to have a global social policy. It has been mentioned that we need a social safety net. We need a social protection floor, which should be considered as an investment. And I'm very grateful that this topic of global social policy actually has been brought into the global discussions on how to combat injustices more and more. So there's a lot to do to transform also development and other policies. And let us not forget that this thesis is really important, that climate adaptation is urgent and it will become more and more costly, especially for the poorest of the world, if we don't invest in it. And also the cost for all of us is really remarkable. And I just like to close by saying that I like this saying that we are all in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. And the inequality lies in this, that we have very different boats, but this is all at the end of going to touch all of us. So we have a common responsibility and interest as well to try to solve these globally.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Very, very important analogy there. Katrina, would you like to say a few words as closing remarks?
Sure. First of all, Viola, thank you so much for your moderation. And I really want to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in today's event on the future of multilateralism, and to the excellent presenters for their briefings. The issue of gender-based violence, women's economic empowerment, women's political participation, and gender and climate issues are high priorities to the work of my office and to the United States government. It's a particularly exciting time to be speaking with you, and this is so timely as the U.S. prepares to launch the first ever government-wide strategy to advance gender equity and equality later this month, which will include addressing climate change and working with the private sector. Additionally, President Biden announced that the U.S. will virtually convene a summit for democracy this December, which will be an opportunity to build on much of what we have discussed today, and we look forward to using your expertise and data. We know that none of this work can be accomplished without partners, and we look forward to working with all of you in the days to come. And thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Monica, a few final words?
Sure, thanks. I want to come back quickly to the conversation around ways to bring people to the table. And, this isn't an original thought from me, but having a conversation about how to invite more people to the table assumes that there's someone who has a certain ownership of the table and the right to invite people. And I'm wondering, is based on the conversation we've had and the excellent points that have been made about needing to change our entire structure, I think we need to maybe get rid of the table and start going into spaces where people actually are and where they're experiencing the effects of COVID and climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution, everything else that we're dealing with, and let them lead the way to solutions that break down what we have currently, which isn't working. And I really appreciate the effort that the Heinrich-Böll Foundation is making to create that conversation and all the contributions that everyone else has made to that today. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. Very much appreciated. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today, and we're just at the final hour here. What a terrific discussion, with so much to think about as we go forward in this time of global crisis, but also, we hope, increasing global awareness and discussion about how to protect human rights, particularly gender rights, in a future multilateral order. I want to thank our three authors for applying their brain power to these vexing issues, and to our three policymakers and experts from the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations for their thoughtful responses. Be sure to check out the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung website for the series of papers on the future of multilateralism and so much more. And a reminder that a video of this event will be available on YouTube shortly afterwards. On behalf of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Brussels and Washington, D.C., thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.